partly done. Just a reminder, Monday, of course, you guys have the map project, which is due. Those of you who haven't started it have the weekend now to work on it. Make sure that you get all your questions answered today, because those are going to be due in class on Monday. Yeah?
In lecture or
in lecture, yeah. So those of you who have section on Wednesdays, still bring your map with you on Monday. So everything, we'll collect them here, and then Tony and I will take them back to the office. Any questions about the midterm? Was it pretty straightforward? You guys were able to, because everybody got the slide IDs? Were those pretty straightforward too, right? Everybody, when was the cylinder seal from? You guys picked that up, the period? Yes, right, Leda Rook. The materials, right, of course, being softer stones, limestone instead of lapis lazuli and diorite. How about the second one? You guys get that one? Those statues, the plaster statues. Ain Ghazal, right? Good. And that final one, of course, that was the Stele of the Vultures, right? That was the gimme. Okay, cool. All right, great. All right, so we're going to be moving along here today, picking up where we left off last time. We wrapped up before the midterm with the end of the Akkadian period. And we talked about Naram Sin, and we talked about the collapse of, wow, this is really loud today. Sorry, I'm going to move this down so I'm not booming the entire time. There we go. So we talked about Naram Sin and the different conception of kingship we saw under his reign. Naram Sin, in a lot of ways, was a continuation of earlier Akkadian kings like Sargon, with this new emphasis on heroic kingship. But heroic kingship that Naram Sin took to this whole new level, right? Deifying himself, creating himself a god, prefixing his name with that of a god, depicting himself as a god, even perhaps building temples to himself at places like Tel Brak. And of course, right, for a variety of reasons, as we discussed on Monday, the Akkadian Empire begins to crumble. Probably a combination of environmental factors, social pressures, and the policies that Naram Sin was enacting at the time. All these things contributed to the gradual crumbling of this empire and a shift back to the city-states, the prominent city-states that we saw in the previous period during the early dynastic period. And of course, right, when this happens, when an empire falls apart, this is our first empire, right? This is why Sargon is so important. He was able to create this empire, the Akkadian Empire, which goes all the way from the Mediterranean down to the Gulf, with standard conventions, all brought together. When this falls apart, right, you want to explain why. Why did it fall apart? And in this case, right, we left off reading that Curse of Agade, a later Babylonian text, which describes Naram Sin actually launching an attack against the gods themselves, which is never a good idea, and it going very, very badly for him. Agade, of course, becomes cursed. The Guti mountain people come down from the hills. And again, we actually have other inscriptions that talk about the Guti during this time. The Guti being a mountain people that live in the Zagros, right here, probably very closely related to the Lulubis, who, of course, Naram Sin famously depicts being trounced and being stepped on as he makes his way up that mountain in his stele. So we see at the end of the Akkadian period this shift back to city-states and a period of disruption that were caused by these raids coming from the mountains, from the Guti. And with these smaller rulers and cities struggling to gain power and the central system greatly weakened. This is a period of fragmentation. But as we'll see with the fall of our first empire, and as we'll see later in the semester as these empires rise and fall, these periods of destabilization, while we think of them as chaotic, we think of them almost as dark ages. Really, we call them dark ages because we have less monumental inscriptions, we have less texts. But in terms of human ingenuity and in terms of really what it means, for the people themselves, these are periods of time when the shackles come off. These are periods of time when now, you don't have to report to central authorities, and you can start to experiment with new ideas. In the case of Mesopotamia, specifically Sumer in the south, this is a period in which there's a lot of heavy thinking going on. What went wrong? Why did Naram-Sin fall? What did he do? And for God's sake, how can we make sure that that doesn't happen again? Because that was horrible. So these Sumerian city-states begin to coalesce once again around 2100 BC. And it's the beginning of a period, just 100 years, that we call the Neo-Sumerian period. You can see it up on the board. And we start to see the coalescence of city-states around Ur, Uruk, and then also a little bit more to the east in Lagash and Girsu. These two sort of, these small proto-empires beginning to emerge around 2100. This period is actually marked by a shift back to Sumerian. If you remember, right, one of the hallmarks of the Akkadian Empire was the fact that Sargon imposed the Semitic language, Akkadian, on the empire. It became the sort of lingua franca of the empire. Everyone used Akkadian. Sumerian was still used for religious texts. In this case now, Sumerian is coming back. These kings are making a marked attempt to sort of predate the Akkadian experiment, right? Like, well, that didn't go very well. We're going to go back to our roots. We're going to start speaking Sumerian again and go back to the traditions that were working prior to this disaster with Naram-Sin. What's interesting is while they do try to go back to this sort of early city-state period, the changes that we saw in the conceptions of kingship in the Akkadian period remain. There still is this sense of a heroic king. The king is still central to this system, but this time, instead of it being a godlike warrior king, as we saw with Naram-Sin, Sargon to an extent, but especially with Naram-Sin, now there's a new emphasis. Instead of this warlike character and boasting of military conquest, there's an emphasis on piety. There's an emphasis on the king's role in securing that cycle that we saw very early on, actually beginning with the Uruk period, in which the king plays this key role in making the cycle and the relationship with the gods productive, right? So we looked at this before. We have our gods at the top. Our gods are responsible for nature, making the land productive, right? Which we, the people of the land are dependent on. And in turn, right, the gods themselves expect our devotion and our worship, and to a certain extent are dependent on us. We build their temples, we house them. In certain mythologies, right, we were created for the sole purpose of serving them because they didn't want to serve themselves. They were lazy. Right, so we saw before that in the center of this, our end figure, our king, plays a crucial role in making that cycle safe and productive. And in this case, we saw a king, which Naram-Sin violated that, and that curse of Agade, the text we read on Monday, really emphasizes what happens. Well, just how everything gets messed up when this system falls out of alignment. So there's a shift back now to a central king, where, like in the Akkadian period, the king plays this very important role, but now that role is emphasized on piety. The king is not boasting about his military conquest, he's boasting about how many temples he built. And we're going to see this in the south in a number of places. This period in the south is called the Third Dynasty of Ur, or the Ur III period. It marks the third time that Ur ruled Sumer in the Sumerian king list. And you can see here, it begins in two separate places. One at Ur, in sort of the edge here. This is a later map of the Ur III state, which begins to expand. And we're going to talk about the Ur III expansion and the state and its apparatus in depth next time. But in this beginning period around 2100, we see rulers like Utu-Hegal and his son Ur-Nama taking power of Ur and Uruk. And then a little bit farther to the east at Lagash and Girsu, we see a king named Ur-Bau and then his son Gudea, who begin to take power. We're going to be focusing on this eastern section today. But in many ways, they follow traditions that were established in the Akkadian period. For example, Ur-Nama, if you were going to be a good Akkadian king, and Ur-Nama is trying to figure out, he's going to adopt some Akkadian traditions but go back to some Sumerian traditions. If you're Ur-Nama and you're thinking in terms of things set up in the Akkadian times, what are you going to do with your daughter? Make her high priestess, exactly, right? Make her high priestess of Nana at Ur, which is what Sargon did, which is what Naram-Sin did, and what kings will continue to do. He actually goes a step farther and makes his son the high priest of Inanna at Uruk. So what else are you going to do to mark your reign? What are some other kingly acts? There are some military conquests during this time, right? So defend your borders, yeah. Take over, yeah, okay, so certainly there is this process. And we will see, by the time we get to Gudea, Lagash is going to start expanding its borders and taking over places like Girsu to the north. What else do you do? What else do kings do? I mean, you have the power, yeah.
They also marry their other children off to kings or governors.
Absolutely. There is a lot of intermarriage during this period. Gudea, for example, who we're going to talk about in a second, like Sargon, he doesn't have a father in the Sumerian king list. And chances are he was the son of a local governor and married into the royal family and then took power that way. So certainly intermarriage. What about tangible things? What do kings do? We talked about temples. What else do they make? It's probably a little too obvious. I'm being too... Sorry? Yeah, artifacts, right? They make monuments, right? So in this sense, Ur-Nammu is going to follow these traditions and continue making large royal stelae, just like Sargon did, just like Naram-Sin did. Only now we can see already that this composition is radically different than what we saw in the time of Naram-Sin, right? Naram-Sin was violating all those conventions. He was the only actor in his stele, smashing the lulubis up. In this case, and the gods, right? The gods were up at the very top, just abstract symbols, almost an afterthought. In this case, we see a marked shift back to these earlier Sumerian conventions, right? Where again we're seeing registers, we're seeing the king acting in a very pious way, right? Worshipping the gods, making offerings to them. So again, unifying the land, bringing it together, but instead of doing it through force, doing it through a very complicated legal system. Actually, this is a very bureaucratic time. We have over 120,000 texts dating to the Ur-3 period. It's considered in antiquity to be the best documented century in antiquity. And we're going to look at some of those texts because they can tell us quite a bit about how this bureaucracy worked. So uniting the land again through conventions, through politics as opposed to force. And again, stressing, the glory and power of the king, but not through his military might, but mainly through his piety, through religion, and through building projects. We'll see this changes a little bit later on. Ur-Nammu's son, which we'll kind of focus on next time, he ends up proclaiming himself to be a divinity again, but not a divinity like Naram-Sin, not a city god. They take the title of God of the land, but it's much more subdued. We're going to be, again, covering this period, the Ur-3 period to the east, in depth next week. But right now, let's get back to Lagash.